The sun had just started to rise over the quiet town of Willow Creek. The streets were still damp from the light rain that fell the night before. Birds were waking up, and the sound of their chirping mixed with the hum of cars beginning their morning routines. It was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. A black man in his mid-40s jogged down the sidewalk, dressed in a gray hoodie and running pants. His steps were steady, his face calm. He wasn't in a hurry. It was part of his morning ritual, a peaceful run before heading to work. He had done this same route for years. He liked the quiet of the early hours, the way the town felt before it fully woke up. After finishing his run, he slowed down and stopped by a small diner on the corner. It was an old place that smelled of coffee and bacon even from the outside. He often came here for a quick breakfast. Nothing fancy, just black coffee and toast. The waitress waved when he walked in. He smiled back, took a seat by the window, and ordered his usual. Outside, a police car drove slowly past the diner. Inside it were two young white officers, both new to the force, still learning the ropes. They had been partners for about a year. The older one was serious and strict, the kind who liked doing things by the book. The younger one was more eager, always looking to prove himself. As they passed the diner, the younger officer noticed the black man sitting in a parked car outside. He was looking at his phone, not doing anything wrong, just sitting there. But the young officer nudged his partner. "Hey, doesn't that look a bit off to you?" he asked. The older one looked over. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," the younger one said. "He's just sitting there, engine running, looking around. Could be waiting for someone. Or maybe casing the area." The older officer frowned. "We've had a few reports of car thefts around this part of town lately. Let's go check it out." They pulled over near the diner and parked behind the man's car. Inside the diner, the man finished his coffee and stepped out, holding a small takeout cup in his hand. He opened his car door and sat down, scrolling through a few messages before starting the engine. That's when he saw the police car's reflection in his rearview mirror. He sighed quietly but didn't move. He had been through this kind of thing before, too many times in fact. The officers stepped out of their car and walked toward him. The man rolled his window down halfway and waited. "Morning, sir," the older officer said. "Can we see your license and registration?" The man raised his eyebrows. "Good morning, sure. May I ask what this is about?" "We've had a few break-ins in the area," the younger officer replied quickly. "You looked like you were watching something, so we just want to make sure everything's fine." The man smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it. "I was just having breakfast, same as I do every morning." "License and registration, please," the older officer repeated, his tone firmer now. The man didn't argue. He reached slowly into his glove compartment, handed over the documents, and kept his hands visible on the steering wheel. The officers walked back to their car to run his information. As they did, one of them muttered, "Why do they always get defensive when we're just doing our job?" The other one didn't answer. He was looking at the license, and the name on it seemed familiar, but he couldn't place where he had heard it before. Still, he didn't think too much of it and radioed in the details for a check. Inside the car, the man waited patiently. He took a sip of his coffee and looked at the people passing by. Some glanced his way, probably wondering what was going on. He didn't like being the center of attention, especially not in moments like this. A few minutes passed, and the officers returned. "Everything checks out," the older one said, "but we're going to need to ask you a few more questions." The man looked puzzled. "About what?" "Just routine," the younger officer replied. "Mind stepping out of the car?" He hesitated. "Officer, I've told you already I was just having breakfast. There's no reason for me to step out." That answer didn't sit well with them. The younger cop crossed his arms. "Look, sir, we can do this the easy way or the hard way." The man sighed. "And what exactly is the hard way?" The younger officer took a step closer. "Don't test me, all right? Just step out of the car." The man looked at him for a moment, calm, collected, but clearly disappointed. He knew where this was going. He slowly opened the door and got out, keeping his hands in plain sight. "Now put your hands on the hood," the older officer said. "For what?" the man asked. "You said everything checked out." "We're just making sure you don't have any weapons," the younger one replied quickly. The man shook his head slightly. "This is unnecessary. You're making a mistake." "Do as we say," the older one said sharply. He didn't resist. He turned around and placed his hands on the hood of his car. The metal was cool against his palms, The officers began to search his pockets. People were starting to stop and watch. A few took out their phones, quietly recording what was happening. "Officer," the man said in a calm but steady voice, "you're crossing a line. You should call your supervisor." That sentence made the younger officer pause for a second. "Why's that?" "You think calling a supervisor is going to change something?" "I think it'll stop you from making this worse," the man said softly. The older officer ignored him and kept searching. He found nothing, of course, but the look on his face showed frustration, not because the man had done something wrong, but because he hadn't. He didn't like being challenged, even politely. When they finished, the man turned around slowly. "Are we done?" The older officer looked unsure. The younger one wasn't ready to let go yet. "You're awfully calm for someone being questioned by police," he said, trying to sound intimidating. The man met his eyes and said, "That's because I know exactly who I am." "Do you?" The younger officer frowned, confused by the response. Before he could say anything, the radio on his shoulder crackled. A voice from dispatch said something about the license number they had just called in. The words weren't clear to the bystanders, but they made both officers glance at each other. The man didn't say a word. He just watched them, his calm expression never changing. "Sir," the older officer began, could you confirm your full name again?" The man nodded slowly. "I already did. But go ahead." The younger officer repeated the name quietly, almost to himself. His eyes widened a little, but he said nothing. They both stepped back for a moment, whispering to each other. Inside the diner, the waitress who had served the man earlier was now standing by the window, looking worried. She had seen him come in almost every morning. She knew he wasn't the kind of man to cause trouble. Outside, tension hung in the air. People were filming, cars slowed down, and murmurs spread. The officer seemed unsure of what to do next. The man crossed his arms, still patient but clearly disappointed. "You've got what you need," he said quietly. "Now maybe you should listen to your radio." The older officer turned back toward the car, pretending to check something, but his hand was shaking slightly. The younger one looked nervous. "Maybe we should," he started, but stopped mid-sentence. "Not yet," the older officer interrupted. "We'll sort this out," the man sighed again. "You're already sorting it out," he said softly. "Just not the way you think." The younger officer didn't respond. His confidence from earlier seemed to fade. Something about the man's calmness unsettled him, like he was missing something important. The bystanders started whispering louder now. "Why are they doing that to him?" Someone said. "He didn't do anything." Another added, "This doesn't look right." One man across the street quietly said, "I think I've seen that guy before. But not here. Maybe on the news." The scene felt heavy, the kind where everyone knew something wasn't right but no one knew how it would end. The officers stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. The man just waited quietly, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "You've still got time to do the right thing," he said finally. "I'd take that chance if I were you." Neither of them replied. They just stared at him, caught between pride and doubt, between authority and fear. The sound of the radio crackled again, the same dispatcher's voice coming through, louder this time. Whatever she said made both officers' expressions change instantly. The man didn't move. He simply looked at them and said, "Now you understand." The younger officer swallowed hard. "Sir, are you saying—" The man didn't answer yet. He turned his gaze toward the growing crowd, then back to the officers. His calm voice carried just enough weight to make everyone silent around him. "Let's just say," he said quietly, "you're about to realize who you've been talking to." The two officers looked at each other, their confidence melting into confusion. The moment of truth was coming, and neither of them was ready for what they were about to learn. The two officers froze for a moment, staring at the man with wide eyes. Something in his calm voice, the way he held himself, made them both hesitate. The radio crackled again, and this time the dispatcher repeated the name and the badge number. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. You can't be serious," the younger officer stammered, his face turning pale. He glanced at his partner, hoping the older one would have some kind of explanation. But the older officer's eyes were just as wide, his mouth slightly open, unable to form the words. The man didn't smile, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I am serious. I'm Sheriff Brooks." Time seemed to stop. The bystanders froze mid-step. Some of them gasped quietly. A few lowered their phones, their eyes wide. The realization sank in slowly, but it sank in deeply. The younger officer's knees felt weak. "Sheriff, you mean—" "The sheriff?" he asked, barely audible. "Yes," the man replied calmly. "The sheriff of this county. And I'm standing here unarmed, not threatening anyone. You want to explain why you thought it was okay to treat me this way?" The older officer's hand went to the back of his neck. He swallowed hard and looked away. His mind raced. How could they have made such a mistake? He had the documents, he had the license plate, everything should have been clear. And yet, here he was standing in front of the sheriff he had just roughly pulled out of his car. We thought you were someone else," the younger officer managed to say. "We didn't know—" "You didn't know?" the sheriff repeated, his tone calm but firm. "You didn't take a moment to check who I am before you decided to humiliate me? To handcuff me? To pull me out of my car in front of everyone?" The older officer looked down at the ground. We were just following procedure," he muttered. "Following procedure?" the sheriff repeated, shaking his head slightly. "Do you even hear yourselves? This isn't about procedure. This is about respect. About judgment. About basic human decency. Do you really think anyone should be treated like this just because of the color of their skin? Or because someone thinks they look suspicious?" The younger officer's hands trembled slightly. He tried to find the right words, but none of them came out right. He felt a wave of shame crash over him. All the confidence he had felt that morning, all the certainty that he was doing the right thing was gone. A small crowd had gathered now. People were whispering among themselves. Some were shaking their heads. Others were muttering into their phones, capturing the moment. The sheriff didn't yell, didn't try to fight back. He simply stood there, calm, steady, and completely in control. One older man in the crowd muttered, "I've never seen anything like this." Another whispered, "They've got to be disciplined. That's wrong." The sheriff turned to face the officers fully, his eyes locking on both of them. "You have the power to protect people. That's your job. But with that power comes responsibility. And what you just did? It was irresponsible, reckless, and it could have ended differently if I weren't me. Do you understand that?" The officers nodded, though they didn't speak. Their faces were pale, their pride completely shattered. The sheriff raised his hands slightly, palms outward. "I'm not going to make this worse than it already is. I'm not going to call for arrests. I'm not going to yell at you in front of this crowd. But you need to understand me, what you did was wrong. You humiliated me, you disrespected me, and you embarrassed your department. That's not acceptable, ever." The younger officer's voice cracked when he spoke. "Sheriff, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" The sheriff held up his hand, stopping him. "Don't start with excuses. Just understand the weight of what happened. Remember it. Learn from it. You can't erase what you did, but you can make sure it never happens again." The older officer finally found his voice, though it was low and shaken. We just followed what we thought was procedure," he repeated, more to himself than to the sheriff. We didn't think." "You didn't think," the sheriff said quietly, shaking his head. "And that's exactly the problem. You need to think. Not just follow orders, not just check boxes. Think about the people in front of you. Think about the consequences. Think about humanity. That's what matters most." The younger officer looked at his partner. "We messed up," he whispered. "Yes," the older one replied, his voice barely audible. "We messed up," the sheriff nodded. "Good, at least you recognize it. That's the first step. But recognition isn't enough. You need to act differently. You need to be better." The crowd, which had been tense and quiet, started murmuring again. Some people whispered words of approval for the sheriff, some words of shock at what had happened. Cameras continued to click. Phones continued to record. The sheriff finally turned his attention back to the officers. "You're not going to hurt anyone else today. That's my responsibility now. But you're going to carry this lesson with you, and it better change the way you do your job." The younger officer nodded quickly, almost frantically. "Yes, Sheriff. We understand. We will. We promise." The older officer stayed quiet, simply nodding. His pride had been stripped away in the harshest way possible, and it left him feeling exposed and humbled. The sheriff took a deep breath. He looked around at the crowd, then back at the officers. "I'm going to leave now. You need to make a choice. Continue down the path you were on, or take this moment and learn. The choice is yours." With that, he stepped away from his car. He walked calmly toward the diner where he had parked and got in. People whispered and gasped as they watched the sheriff drive away, leaving the officer standing there, stunned and embarrassed. For a long moment, neither officer moved. The younger one finally looked down at his shoes, shaking his head. "I can't believe that just happened," he said quietly. The older officer didn't respond. He just stared at the pavement, trying to process everything. His mind replayed the moment again and again. The calm voice, the steady hands, the presence of authority without aggression. He had seen power before, but never like this. This was something different. Something real. Something that demanded respect, not fear. The younger officer glanced at the crowd. People were starting to walk away, whispering and muttering among themselves. A few cameras still pointed toward the officers, capturing the aftermath. He felt exposed, like everyone could see right through him. I should have checked, the younger officer said finally. "We should have checked." "Yes," the older one said quietly. "We should have, but we didn't, and now we have to live with that." Neither officer moved for a few more seconds. They both felt the weight of what had happened. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a lesson they would never forget. The sheriff had taught it without shouting, without violence, just by standing tall and calm. Finally, the younger officer spoke again. "Do you think we'll be okay?" The older one shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but we better hope so, and we better do everything we can to make sure it never happens again." They both looked around at the quieting street, at the few people still watching. They knew their actions had been wrong. They knew the sheriff had shown them the truth about respect, about judgment, about how power should be handled. And they also knew that this moment, embarrassing, humbling, shocking, was a turning point. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked, and life in the town continued. But for those two officers, nothing would ever be the same. The morning that started like any other had ended with a lesson in humanity, one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. And for the sheriff, the incident would not just be a story to tell. It would be a reminder of the work still to be done, the work of teaching respect, understanding, and fairness in a world that often moved too fast to notice the people in front of it. The sheriff drove away slowly, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind calm but alert. He wasn't angry in the way most people might have expected. Anger wasn't what he wanted in that moment. What he wanted was clarity, for the officers to understand, for the people who witnessed it to understand, and for the system itself to recognize what had gone wrong. By the time he reached his office, the town was beginning to buzz. News travels fast in small towns like Willow Creek, especially when something unusual happens at the corner diner. Within an hour, people were already whispering about the incident. Phones lit up with videos recorded by bystanders, capturing the officers fumbling, the sheriff standing calm, and the stunned expressions of everyone present. Inside the sheriff's office, he called a meeting with his deputy and a few trusted staff. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly. "It's bigger than that. Two officers mishandled a situation, but it could have happened to anyone. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again, and we need to act before it becomes a crisis." They nodded in agreement. His deputy, a thoughtful woman with years of experience, spoke first. "Sheriff, do you want to press charges?" He shook his head. "No, that's not the point. I don't want to punish them. I want them to learn. I want the department to learn, and we need to reassure the public that this kind of mistake won't be repeated." He made a few calls, including one to the local media office. "We need a statement," he said. "Not to shame anyone, but to explain what happened, why it matters, and what we're doing to prevent it from happening again." Meanwhile, the two officers were left standing on the street, still processing what had happened. Their colleagues who had heard about the incident began arriving, some out of curiosity, others out of concern. A few whispered words of encouragement, but most avoided eye contact. No one wanted to say the wrong thing or appear insensitive. The younger officer kept replaying the event in his mind. He could still hear the sheriff's calm voice, see his steady hands, the way he spoke without raising them, the way he demanded respect without force. He felt exposed, embarrassed, and guilty all at once. "I can't believe we did that," he muttered under his breath. "Neither can I," the older officer replied quietly. "I've been a cop for over 15 years, and I've never been humiliated like this. And for good reason. That man, he taught us a lesson without even trying to." They both knew that lesson was going to stay with them forever. By late morning, the story had spread across social media. Videos from multiple angles were circulating. People from all over the county commented, some outraged, some supportive, but most shocked. Some shared their own experiences with harassment or mistreatment, and the sheriff's name appeared repeatedly in the posts. Inside the sheriff's office, the phone never stopped ringing. People were calling to express support, concern, and questions about what was happening. Community leaders reached out to schedule meetings, and local churches asked if the sheriff could speak about respect, fairness, and justice. One reporter arrived unannounced, hoping for a comment. The sheriff invited her into his office and explained calmly what had happened. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about what could happen to anyone. The officers made a mistake and we're handling it internally. We are also taking steps to prevent such mistakes in the future. That's the real story here." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes furiously. She asked about the officers' reactions. The sheriff smiled faintly. "They are learning. That's all I can ask for. I want this to be a teaching moment, not just for them, but for the whole department." Meanwhile, the two officers had been taken to a private room at their precinct. Their supervising sergeant spoke to them in low tones. "You messed up," he said bluntly. "There's no sugarcoating it. The sheriff isn't filing charges, but don't think this goes away. You're going to have to face the investigation and you're going to have to explain yourselves." The younger officer nodded miserably. "We know. We didn't think. We didn't check." The older officer stayed silent, his mind racing with regret. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he muttered finally. "But we were wrong," the sergeant sighed. "Yes, you were. And now you have a choice. You can either let this define you in the worst way, or you can take it as a lesson and actually change how you do your job." The officers spent the next few hours giving statements. They recounted every detail, from the moment they saw the man in the car to the moment they realized he was the sheriff. They admitted mistakes openly, though awkwardly, feeling the weight of accountability pressing down on them. Meanwhile, back in the community, the incident was sparking conversations. People spoke in coffee shops, on sidewalks, and in grocery stores about what they had seen. Some people were furious that the officers had treated anyone like that, regardless of who they were. Others were relieved that the sheriff had handled it calmly and wisely. A few parents began to discuss the importance of teaching respect to young people, how authority should be used responsibly, and how misunderstandings could escalate into dangerous situations. The sheriff's calm approach became a model in their conversations, a reminder that power could be used wisely and peacefully. At the sheriff's office, he began planning workshops and community meetings. He wanted to address bias, judgment, and the way officers handled situations like these. He believed that change started with conversation, not punishment. He also knew the officers involved needed guidance, not just discipline. The next day, both officers were called in again. This time, the sheriff invited them personally. He didn't scold them. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke about responsibility, empathy, and the importance of seeing the person in front of you before acting. "You have a job that demands respect," he said quietly, looking each of them in the eyes. "But respect doesn't come from fear. It comes from understanding, from listening, from caring. You need to remember that in every decision you make." The younger officer nodded eagerly. "Yes, Sheriff. I understand. I really do." The older officer took a deep breath. "I see that now. I understand too." The sheriff gave a small nod. "Good. Learning from mistakes is hard, but it's what makes you better." Outside, the community continued to talk about the incident. Some people were still angry, some were still in disbelief, but most were thinking about the larger message, that respect and understanding mattered more than power or authority. The sheriff made a public statement later that week. He didn't talk about the humiliation he had faced. He didn't single out the officers. Instead, he focused on the lessons learned, the importance of fairness, and the need for ongoing training in respect and empathy. The situation could have gone much worse, he said, but it didn't, and that's a relief. What we must focus on now is how to ensure it never happens again. This isn't about blame. It's about growth. Growth for our department, for our officers, and for our community. Social media continued to buzz, but the tone shifted. People began to share messages about learning from mistakes, about calm leadership, and about the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Videos of the incident were still being viewed, but instead of anger alone, there were comments about how the sheriff's calmness had turned a potential disaster into a lesson in humanity. For the two officers, every interaction, every conversation after that morning became a reflection on their actions. They found themselves thinking about the sheriff's words, about the quiet strength he had shown, and about the difference between authority and understanding. Days later, the sheriff began to organize workshops in the community, inviting residents and officers alike. The focus was not on punishment or humiliation. The focus was on learning, understanding, and building trust. He spoke calmly, clearly, and sincerely, sharing the story without shame but with purpose. "We all make mistakes," he said in one of the sessions, "but we can choose to learn from them. We can choose to be better. And that choice is what defines us." People listened intently. Officers who had once thought of their job as purely about enforcement began to understand the deeper responsibility they carried. Residents began to see the human side of law enforcement, that even in uniform people could learn, grow, and change. The sheriff didn't stop there. He personally met with the two officers again, this time in a more private setting. They talked openly about what had happened, why it had happened, and what could be done differently. The conversation was honest, sometimes awkward, but always productive. "You have a second chance," the sheriff told them. "Not everyone gets one. Use it wisely." The officers left that meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew they had been wrong. They knew they had been humbled. But they also knew they had been given a rare opportunity to change, not just for themselves, but for everyone they would encounter in the future. In Willow Creek, the incident became a turning point. It was a story that reminded people of the importance of respect, of calm leadership, and of learning from mistakes. The sheriff continued his work quietly, calmly, ensuring that the lesson extended beyond one morning and one incident. And for the two officers, every day became a reflection of that lesson, a reminder that authority is not about fear, but about understanding, that power without empathy can harm, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from moments you never expected. The day after the incident, the sheriff arrived at the office early. He knew this morning would be different. The moment had passed on the street, but its impact was still very real. The town had seen the video, the people had talked about it, and the officers involved were already under scrutiny. He didn't want anger, blame, or public outrage to overshadow the lesson he wanted to teach. The sheriff called a meeting with his administrative team. "We need to be clear," he said, "about what happened yesterday and what happens next. Transparency is important. People need to know that mistakes are acknowledged and addressed. And our officers need guidance, not just punishment." His deputy nodded. "Do you want to hold a press conference?" she asked. "Yes," he replied, "but carefully. I want the message to focus on learning and respect, not shaming anyone. The public needs to see accountability, but also hope." Meanwhile, the two officers had been placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was conducted. They reported to the precinct reluctantly, aware that the events of the previous morning were already being talked about throughout the town. Their supervisor explained the process calmly. "You'll need to give statements," he said. "Everything you remember, be honest. This is about understanding what went wrong and preventing it from happening again." The younger officer had trouble keeping his hands still. He replayed the sheriff's calm voice over and over in his head, the steady way he had stood without aggression, demanding respect without shouting. "I can't believe I treated him like that," he said quietly to his partner. "We both messed up," the older officer admitted. "But this is a chance. Maybe one of the few chances we'll get to fix how we act in the future." They gave their statements, detailing everything from the moment they saw the man in the diner parking lot to the moment they discovered his identity. Every word was filled with honesty, though sometimes awkward and hesitant. The investigators listened carefully, asking clarifying questions, taking notes. They needed the full story to determine what led to the officers' actions and how to prevent similar situations in the future. The sheriff spent the morning reviewing video footage from the diner and nearby businesses. He wanted to see the incident from every angle. Every frame confirmed what he already knew. The officers had acted on assumptions, not facts. They had allowed bias, fear, and misunderstanding to override judgment, and yet there had been no violence beyond the rough handling of a calm, compliant man. That fact, he realized, was almost miraculous. By late morning, reporters were gathering outside the sheriff's office. People wanted answers, explanations, and assurances. The sheriff stepped out to speak. He didn't raise his voice or act defensive. He spoke slowly, clearly, and sincerely. "Yesterday, an unfortunate situation occurred involving 2 officers in our department and myself," he said. "I want to make it clear that no one was harmed, and the situation has been addressed internally. Mistakes were made. Lessons need to be learned, and that is the focus of our efforts now." The crowd listened quietly. He continued, "This is not about punishment or shame. It is about understanding, empathy, and responsibility. We all have a duty to treat every person with respect, regardless of appearances, assumptions, or fear. That is the foundation of our work, and it is what the public deserves." He stepped back, nodding briefly to his staff, and returned inside. The reporters began scribbling notes, already talking amongst themselves. Social media exploded as his statement was shared, quoted, and discussed. People praised his calmness and focus on teaching, while some criticized the officer's actions. But the sheriff had anticipated that. He had no intention of letting anger dominate the conversation. The lesson, he believed, needed to come first. Meanwhile, the officers sat quietly in the precinct. They had spent hours writing detailed accounts and answering questions. Now they waited to learn the results of the internal investigation. Both of them were tense, knowing that the sheriff had already seen the footage and that the town had witnessed their mistake. A few hours later, the department's internal affairs officer entered the room. "We've reviewed the statements, the video, and the witness accounts," he said. "The sheriff has decided that formal criminal charges will not be filed. However, there will be consequences. You will both undergo retraining focused on bias awareness, de-escalation, and community relations. You will also meet with the community in structured sessions to discuss accountability and respect. This is an opportunity to learn and rebuild trust." The younger officer exhaled sharply. "Thank you. We understand." The older officer nodded slowly. "We'll do it." "We will." The deputy sheriff later met with them privately. "This is serious," she said, "but it's also rare. Not many officers get the chance to correct their mistakes in such a visible and constructive way. Use it wisely. The public is watching, and so is the department. But more importantly, you need to watch yourselves." In the days that followed, community leaders reached out. Churches, local nonprofits, and neighborhood groups requested meetings. They wanted to understand what had happened, what measures were being taken, and how the town could prevent similar incidents. The sheriff welcomed each conversation. He didn't lecture. He listened, acknowledged concerns, and shared the lessons he had learned firsthand about bias, judgment, and respect. Some of the town's residents admitted they had been nervous at first. They had watched the videos and worried about the behavior of law enforcement. Others expressed relief that the sheriff had remained calm and handled the situation responsibly. Slowly, the town began to talk openly about what respect and responsibility really meant. The 2 officers participated in community sessions as part of their retraining. Sitting in a room full of residents, they shared what they had learned. Their voices were quiet but honest. They admitted mistakes, expressed regret, and described how the sheriff's calmness had shown them a better way to handle difficult situations. One elderly man in the audience spoke softly. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said, "and it takes even more courage to learn from it. Thank you for being honest." The younger officer nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "We are learning. We will do better." The older officer added, "This isn't just about us. It's about everyone we serve. And we want to make sure we never make the same mistake again." The sheriff observed quietly from the corner of the room. He didn't interrupt. He knew that their acknowledgement and willingness to learn were more powerful than any reprimand he could give. The lesson had already taken root. Back at the sheriff's office, he met with his staff to discuss long-term strategies. They planned workshops on empathy, bias awareness, and responsible authority for all officers in the department. They also developed a public education campaign, encouraging residents to engage with law enforcement in ways that fostered trust and mutual respect. The sheriff reflected quietly on the events of the past few days. He knew that while this incident could have been a disaster, it had instead become a turning point. The town had seen a mistake handled with accountability. The officers had been humbled and educated, and the community had an opportunity to engage in meaningful conversation about respect and fairness. The officers themselves began reflecting daily on the lessons learned. They spoke to their colleagues, shared their experiences, and encouraged others to consider the human side of law enforcement. Their conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but necessary. Each day became an opportunity to rebuild trust, not just with the public, but with themselves. The media continued to follow the story, but the narrative shifted. Articles focused less on the humiliation and more on the lessons learned, the sheriff's leadership, and the department's commitment to change. Social media posts highlighted the positive outcome, that even a serious mistake could lead to growth, understanding, and community engagement. As the week went on, the officers completed their retraining programs. They spent hours in workshops, simulations, and discussions. They practiced de-escalation techniques, explored unconscious bias, and learned strategies to ensure respect and fairness in every encounter. Each session reminded them of the sheriff's calm presence and the importance of seeing the person in front of them, not just the situation. By the end of the week, both officers had transformed. They were no longer the same people who had approached the sheriff with assumptions and fear. They carried with them a new sense of humility, responsibility, and awareness. The sheriff, observing the changes, knew that progress was not instant, but it was real. The officers had faced their mistakes, acknowledged them, and committed to change. And the community had witnessed it, learning that accountability, transparency, and calm leadership could turn even a tense moment into an opportunity for growth. In Willow Creek, the morning that had begun with tension, fear, and misunderstanding was now remembered differently. It had sparked conversations, reflection, and change. It had shown the power of humility, the strength of calm leadership, and the importance of human decency in every interaction. For the two officers, the incident became a daily reminder of responsibility, respect, and the impact of their choices. For the sheriff, it became a lesson in leadership, patience, and the enduring power of guiding people with wisdom rather than force. And for the community, Months had passed since that morning at the diner. The memory of it remained vivid for the two officers, but it no longer carried the sharp edge of panic or humiliation. Instead, it had become a reference point, a moment that reminded them of what mattered most in their work: respect, judgment, and empathy. The sheriff continued his daily routine, but his approach to leadership had deepened. He was more attentive, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood how much influence a single decision could have on lives and the community. He knew that even small mistakes could spiral into larger consequences, if not addressed with care and humility. The younger officer had begun to notice subtle changes in himself. He found himself pausing before making judgments about people he encountered on patrol. He started listening more, observing carefully and asking questions instead of assuming. The incident with the sheriff had taught him the importance of thoughtfulness. He realized that authority without understanding could hurt, and he didn't want to be the cause of that pain again. The older officer had gone through a similar transformation. He had spent years relying on experience and routine, often trusting instincts shaped by habit rather than reflection. The lesson from that morning forced him to confront those assumptions. He began mentoring newer officers differently, emphasizing patience, active listening, and seeing the person in front of them rather than the situation alone. Both officers still remembered the calm voice of the sheriff, the way he had stood without aggression, demanding respect through presence rather than force. It was a lesson that had stayed with them through every interaction, every call, and every encounter since that day. The community had also begun to heal and adapt. The sheriff held periodic town meetings, inviting residents and officers to speak openly. These sessions were not lectures. They were conversations, moments where people could express concerns, share experiences, and ask questions. Residents spoke about fear, bias, and misunderstanding. Officers spoke about pressure, responsibility, and the challenges of the job. The sheriff listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. "We all make mistakes," he told the group one afternoon. "The important part is what we do next. Do we let mistakes define us, or do we learn and grow from them?" People nodded, some silently reflecting, others speaking up to share their own lessons. Parents talked about teaching children empathy. Young people spoke about respect for authority, and officers talked about the need for self-awareness. The sheriff encouraged dialogue, making sure everyone understood that understanding was a two-way street. The two officers became active participants in these sessions. They shared their experiences candidly, speaking about the morning they mishandled the situation with the sheriff. They didn't shy away from admitting their mistakes. They spoke of the embarrassment, the guilt, and the lessons learned. Their honesty was disarming. People listened. Some nodded in agreement, some whispered words of encouragement, and others asked questions about how they could learn from the officer's experience. The younger officer, once quick to assume the worst, now emphasized reflection. "I realize that fear can cloud judgment," he told a group one evening. "But it's up to us to pause, observe, and respond with understanding. That's what we owe the people we serve." The older officer added, "Experience is important, but it isn't everything. We need to remember that every person has dignity. Treating someone fairly and with respect is not a weakness. It's the foundation of our work." Even within the department, the atmosphere began to shift. Officers who had once been rigid in their approach started to reconsider their methods. They paid closer attention to community feedback, engaged more openly with residents, and took their responsibilities more seriously. The sheriff's influence, combined with the lesson learned from that morning, sparked a subtle but meaningful change. Outside the walls of the department, the town started to notice. Residents reported feeling safer and more respected. Conversations at the grocery store, at the coffee shop, and on the sidewalks began to shift from fear and frustration to understanding and cooperation. People spoke about the morning at the diner not as an isolated incident, but as a turning point, a moment that reminded everyone that fairness, patience, and accountability mattered. For the two officers, personal growth came with daily challenges. Old habits didn't disappear overnight. Sometimes, during a difficult call or a tense situation, the memory of that morning came back sharply, reminding them to pause, breathe, and consider their actions. The younger officer found himself quietly repeating the sheriff's words. "See the person in front of you." It had become almost a mantra. The older officer started journaling his experiences after each shift. He reflected on encounters where he had exercised patience and empathy, and he noted moments where he could have done better. Over time, the journaling helped him internalize the lessons, and he began sharing insights with his team during debriefs. The sheriff continued to lead by example. He visited schools, community centers, and local events, emphasizing the importance of fairness, empathy, and communication. He spoke about the morning at the diner as a story, not to glorify himself, but to illustrate the power of calmness, presence, and thoughtful action. Children and adults alike listened closely, absorbing the subtle but powerful message. Respect is earned through understanding, not fear or authority. As the months passed, the town of Willow Creek slowly transformed. Relationships between law enforcement and the community improved. People felt heard and seen. Officers approached their work with renewed purpose, guided by lessons learned rather than assumptions. Mistakes still happened, and human nature is imperfect, but the culture had shifted. Mistakes became opportunities for reflection rather than moments of harm. One evening, the sheriff sat alone in his office reviewing notes from a recent community meeting. He reflected on the officers involved in the diner incident. He remembered their initial embarrassment, their hesitation, and their eventual willingness to learn. He smiled faintly, thinking about how a moment of tension had turned into a moment of growth, not just for them, but for the entire community. He knew the story would be remembered, retold, and shared, not as a tale of humiliation or anger, but as a story of accountability, learning, and human growth. It had reminded everyone, officers, residents, and leaders alike, that mistakes do not define us. How we respond to them does. The younger officer, walking home after a long shift, thought back to the diner. He remembered the calmness, the voice, the steady presence of the sheriff. That memory no longer filled him with shame. Instead, it served as a guide. He had learned humility, patience, and the importance of seeing others as human beings first. The older officer, sitting quietly in his kitchen, reflected on the same moment. He realized that the incident had changed him more than any years of experience could. He had learned that authority is not about fear, that power is not about intimidation, and that respect is earned through consistent, thoughtful action. Together, the two officers had started to mentor younger recruits differently. They spoke about the importance of reflection, empathy, and patience. They shared the story of the morning at the diner, not to shame but to teach. They emphasized that every person encountered, no matter their appearance, their race, or their status, deserves dignity and understanding. The town had also begun to celebrate small changes. Local leaders praised officers who showed patience and empathy. Parents spoke about the lessons they hoped their children would carry forward. And the sheriff continued to quietly guide the department, leading by example, demonstrating that strong leadership comes from calmness, understanding, and moral courage. Years later, the morning at the diner was still remembered, not as a story of fear or humiliation, but as a turning point. It had sparked reflection, dialogue, and change. Officers who had once acted without thought now acted with purpose. Residents who had once feared misunderstanding now engaged in conversation. The community, strengthened by accountability and trust, had learned a vital lesson. Humanity and empathy are the foundation of safety, respect, and justice. For the sheriff, the lesson was clear. Leadership is not about commanding attention or asserting authority. It is about guiding with wisdom, listening with care, and modeling the behavior you wish to see. Mistakes are inevitable. Growth is optional. And the greatest impact comes not from punishment, but from teaching and leading by example. The two officers continued to carry the memory with them, not as a burden, but as a compass. Every day, every interaction, every call reminded them to pause, to see, and to treat every person with dignity. They became officers who were not only skilled at enforcing the law, but also skilled at understanding the people behind every situation. And in Willow Creek, the story of that morning became more than just a tale. It became a lesson in humility, in accountability, in empathy, and in the power of calm, thoughtful leadership. The community grew stronger. The officers grew wiser. And the sheriff, quietly guiding and observing, knew that sometimes the most important victories come not through force, but through patience, understanding, and the courage to teach what is right.